but it's like...
So today we're going to talk about exhibitions again. Last time I got bogged down, as I often do, in the history of exhibitions. And today we're going to be a lot more practical. And we're going to talk about, well, two parts really. Teaching is the first part, and just a quick overview of some of the theories that museum educators like to talk about. I'll be upfront and say this is not my specialty. I'm sort of the curator field. Curator types tend to say, oh, it's all about engagement. And you show them really neat stuff and people will care. And educators tend to say, you know, there's more to it than that. There's theory to that, like there's to everything else. And so I'm going to go over this briefly. This is based on Margaret Lindauer's article, which I'm pretty sure is in the reading, maybe in the readings for next week, because I've sort of played with these 2 weeks. But she talks about there being four big theories that people use for thinking about how to teach in exhibitions. And I'm just going to go through them briefly to remind you of these. But I'll start off up front by saying that it's often not that a single exhibit is one or the other, or that you have to choose different kinds of parts of different parts of different exhibits and different kinds of exhibits choose different things. And it's mostly going into it, keeping this in mind, lets you think about new ways of doing things. So just pretty briefly, most exhibits end up looking like this first one. You know, you have a lot of stuff, you put it out there and invite visitors to explore what seems most interesting to them. This is, in my mind, the way most people deal with exhibits, and there's a lot of literature that suggests no matter how directed you try to be, in fact, people go in there and they wander around and see whatever they want. So the question I have for you is, how do you know if this is working? How do you measure if this is successful? If it's just randomly people learn what they want to learn?
Probably more measured by like what people form memories around. If you're not really building an experience and you don't really have an agenda for what you want them to learn, maybe asking them afterwards what they remember from their experience, which objects stuck with them, or something.
So you want them to do this, really stick with learning rather than experience, say, or did you have a good time kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It seems like it would be more quantitative than qualitative, because you don't necessarily know what the outcome is going to be in terms of what they take out of it, but that they took something out of it is significant.
Or you can just, another possibility, that you just, you know, just if people seem happy and they're wandering around and they're learning things, or just, that's a little bit too dark, but measure of success, visitors freely explore and acquire accurate knowledge relevant to their own interests. And this free exploring, that, you know, they don't just look in there and run out. That's often good enough for an exhibition. So if you have a chance to go up to the Charles River Museum up in Waltham, outside of Boston, it is purely, there's a lot of neat stuff and you can go and wander around. And if you get interested in something and you look closely, there's often an explanation, but there's no sense that there's an order to it or that there's a way that you're supposed to go through it. It's very much sort of free choice exhibition, free choice learning. Next theory, this is sort of the old-fashioned way that everybody likes to say this is a bad thing. So if you're thinking of exhibitions as a place to teach people things, sort of like a lecture in a classroom, how do you set that up, and then how do you measure that?
You can do some sort of survey asking them facts and if they can answer.
I've only ever seen one exhibit where at the end there was a survey that basically gave you a quiz. Decorative arts exhibit, and you know, we're teaching you the styles, and can you identify the styles after you're done? This is enormously tempting. My guess is that most exhibits, in fact, would do really badly if you measure them that way. But that is sort of the assumption that most curators go into things with, is that I know something, you should know this. If you do right, if I want to measure the success by the how much do you learn the things that I'm giving you a quiz on. That's, again, nothing wrong with that. It turns out to be, if you look very closely, this is not the way that most people learn in exhibitions. Money, art history exhibitions are this style of exhibition. This is just the label from the, actually quite a wonderful exhibit at the National Gallery about the making of the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial in Boston. And it is full of facts, and it is a story told from beginning to end. It's chronological. It's very much, it's somebody's lecture on this memorial. It's not uncommon. My guess is the way most people use this, though, is that random access way. Something's interesting, you go and look at it, you read the label next to it. You don't, if you do those tracking surveys of people at exhibitions, no matter how hard you work to say this is the order, this is what you're supposed to see when, it seems like most of the people don't do that. Yeah.
It seems like you could, like, this would be kind of like, you could coherently combine this with Jane McGonigal's idea of gamifying museums, I feel like.
Right.
But you'd have to give people a feeling that they're actually doing well,
Right.
which is kind of the problem, is that museums are incredibly bad at that.
That's a good point. You have no sense that you've succeeded somehow. This is why when kids programs are so often scavenger hunts.
Mm.
You find something, you have a success. Whether it's a learning process or not is another question, but there's very little in the way of feedback in museums, which gamification maybe would help to solve. In fact, I haven't seen it done yet very well. One more constructivist. This is the fancy modern way that we're not interested in teaching you facts. We want you to learn how to learn, which always sounds very good. So it's a dialogue. You want to be able to learn to think like an anthropologist, learn to think like a historian. How do you measure this? Before the words come bouncing in.
You sort of like let them practice doing it, and maybe you have to watch them or like be a part of the process with them.
That's good. So it's a whole lot easier if you're there to work with them. Or you can have interactives that let you have choices and try this, try that, see different things.
Maybe you go and visit an exhibit about fashion, and then there's a space where you can like actually sketch an outfit in the same sort of process that you've seen through like pattern sketches or studios and that type.
That's good. A lot of some of the language that you hear now is having students perform what they learned. So the way you measure things is, can you do it? Can you not just do the, give some facts back, but can you actually do the sort of work? Do you engage in problem solving? Can you repeat back what you learned, but can you have an opinion about something similar? That kind of thing is useful. If you go to the Mashantucket Pequot Museum, they do, in some ways, a model of this. They have a big diorama, walk-around diorama of the caribou hunt, and they say right up front, here's some evidence, we don't really know, what do you think is going on here? Can you figure out what's happening in this? So it's very much about look at things and solve problems. They do a good job with this kind of exhibition at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum. One more theory, again, much more storytelling. If the exhibit tells a good story and it gets you involved with it, that seems to be a way that people like to learn. So it's a movie rather than a bunch of things. And the way that you would see if this works.
If people share their own stories in response.
If they share stories, that's good. Any other? What else?
What's elicited from people?
Yeah. So it's not just that you tell your stories, but that you get them to tell their stories. So words bounce in. Can you make a narrative out of the things you saw. Can you tell a story about it? So this can be done badly, like many timeline exhibitions, where you say, oh, very dark, but there you got 60 years of see that? This is your classic. Here's the beginning, here's the end, there's a narrative. Hard to capture that. This was a short-lived fad in museums to write exhibits as free-form poetry, write labels as free-form poetry. But you know, this is telling a story, and may actually be a good idea. Never took off. Or in a more traditional sort of style of exhibitions, you know, this is a story about Santa Cruz and what was the effect of the railroad, and here's a bunch of facts about it. It's, again, you mix and match all of these styles, thinking about what it is that is right for the story you want to tell for your audience, what you want them to get out of it is really the question. So that's one way of thinking about learning styles or teaching styles in exhibition. The next thing I want to talk a little bit about is the other way that museum educators like to think about the visitors to exhibitions. And this is Gardner's multiple intelligences. As far as I can tell, this has mostly been disproved by the folks who study how brains actually work, and what the categories are keep changing. But in some ways that doesn't matter very much. The main notion to come across here is that in exhibits, people interact in different ways. And so there are many exhibits that are clearly defined as being about word smart. You know, we have a lot of words, you understand the words. If you're good at words, you get the exhibit. If you're good at some of these other things, you know, it doesn't work so well. Especially when you're looking at kids learning. They're more interested in spatial, in moving around and learning through activities than they are in reading more words. And so being able to think about the different ways that your visitors learn is important. The thing that's both so wonderful about exhibitions and so complicated is that audiences are really diverse. You can't assume that everybody in there is, you know, student at Brown University who's gotten very good at learning how to read things. And so just keeping in mind, I'll give you this to read later, but that there are these either 6 or 7 or 8, whatever number of categories, and remembering that your audience is mixed not only as overall, but as individual family groups or individual groups coming through. That sort of thing to keep in mind. Another way to think about this, another way to deal with it, this is from Csikszentmihalyi's article that I read this week, which is this notion that visitors are driven by curiosity and interest. They're there, they're free will visitors, they're on their own. And here he's breaking it into 3 categories: the sensory, intellectual, emotional, which is again just another set of ways of thinking about the ways people learn. And his term is opportunities for involvement, which is a really nice way of thinking about it. You know, you provide all these different ways for people to be involved with the exhibition that gets them hooked. And then if you read the article, he's all about the notion that you need to reward people at an appropriate level. And so you have enough challenges there, enough things you have to learn, and then people enjoy themselves, they lose themselves in the exhibit, they feel like they're learning things, they're happy. So this is, in some ways, a really nice way of a flow chart to say, what are the opportunities for involvement for my visitors in this exhibit? What's going to make it interesting to them? There's one more way that I don't particularly approve of, but is the way that most museum exhibits are driven nowadays, which is by learning standards. So every school district, every state, every organization has a long list of standards that you're supposed to learn and be able to deal with in every grade level. And you can go online and see these things. This is Rhode Island Social Studies Standards. I forget what grade this is. But there's endless tables. This is probably a 50-page document of what it is you're supposed to learn in different grades. And my impression is that every museum cites these and can give every teacher a document that says this exhibit meets up with the standard. Whether anyone actually does that in a useful way, whether it makes sense, or whether this is just what you need to do to get kids to have field trips to your school, is not clear to me. When you look at these closely, it's very hard to know how it is that you're supposed to use them. Yeah.
So does the state review museum programming?
No, it's not that they review the museum programming, but if you want school kids to come on school time, you have to be able to convince the teachers in the school district that you're meeting the standards that they're being tested on. This is partly the No Child Left Behind changes in the way education works. Everything's being tested. You have to be clear what you're tested on. You have to be able to meet those standards. Yeah.
We do this at the RISD Museum, like where we have to draw up a lesson plan. But frequently what happens, the teacher will say, this is what we're learning in school and this is what the kids know, and so then they get to the museum and you try to like tap into that, but it turns out the kids don't know any of that.
Right.
So it's like kind of like, I don't even know what, I think it is just a way for them to have the museum visit, which isn't necessarily bad. And
Right. No, I'm all in
so-
favor of that, but
it is
right.
hard to like link up the curriculum and the.
yeah, I couldn't find. You will find many museums have online. I should circulate it. Of an exhibit, a list of exhibits with what standards they meet, and sometimes in enormous detail. Because, like I say, this is 50 pages worth of charts like this, and this is just the civics and government strand, which my bet is no one actually teaches to anymore because it's not on the New England assessment test. And there's this for art, there's for math, for reading, for everything you can imagine. There's a test and there's standards. It is a huge part of what museum educators worry about now. It's sort of a shame to my mind, but they're out there. There's standards for arts. Some of them are at this level, which are so both innocuous and sort of hard to understand. Will be knowledgeable about resources. Respond critically to a variety of works. That's how can you be against it? But then you end up with another page that is hugely detailed. I guess I should say up front, I'm not a museum educator. That I have a hard time convincing myself that this is a useful way for museums to spend their time. But it is a big deal right now and something you should know about.
Well, there are interesting projects going on. The Denver Museum was doing a project knowing that a lot of arts was getting left behind in different school
Right.
standards. So they got grant funding and put together a project where they're creating lesson plans through a website that uses objects from the museums, but creates lesson plans that include the standards for social studies for these different things. So there are ways for teachers who like feel connected to the arts or want to bring arts into like a math lesson or social science lesson.
So there's a lot of that because things like arts and history, for that matter, get left out of most school standards now. Yeah.
And also, like at the high school level, if students can get credit for a program, it can really make it more likely that they're actually going to attend and really get involved in the program, and also that the museum can get funding and get support from the schools. Like in DC, they have a program where kids learn about urban planning and they get credit for it in high school, which is pretty awesome because they'd never have access to that in their school.
Right. No, there are ways to make this work. It just always becomes more difficult. Or the other side of that is it makes the museums be a little bit more thoughtful about what they're presenting. It makes them say, we have a real audience out there that has particular needs. Let's think about how to fit those needs.
I think it comes into more of the civic mission of the museum. museums looking at like what their social responsibility is, how can they promote their mission in new ways, looking at like what's getting cut out of schools and kind of caring for the larger picture around them and not just what's inside of their walls.
That's one of the challenges I'm dealing with. I'm working with the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. It's opening in 2017. It's like my job with the program. And one of our issues is realizing well, we're trying to write to an 8th grade level, but it's really what's been put out there from museums. But we don't know what 8th graders know, especially about civil rights and their local. Well, it's supposed to be about more like local stories and not the popular narrative of the civil rights movement. But that's the challenge of like, how do you know what teachers are teaching and where do you start? Like, you have to give them a foundation.
So what the standards are, what teachers are actually teaching, what kids actually know are 3 different things.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of kids know more.
Yeah.
Well, I imagine that one of the challenges too is that if you're creating exhibitions towards these learning standards, then you're assuming your audiences are kids or middle schoolers or teenagers, and to try and create something that actually appeals to a wide range of audiences, I'm just curious how that would actually play out, if it ends up alienating any of the other audiences if you're playing to the social studies standards, for example.
It's a really good question. The way that most museum people would respond is that exhibits are big, complicated places. People go and see the things that are interesting to them. And so you can have several different levels overlaid on top of one exhibition. You can have some that are aimed at collectors, some that are aimed at experts, some that are aimed at 6-year-old kids. Whether that's really true or not is up for grabs, I think. Sometimes it works, sometimes it just becomes a little bit for everybody and doesn't make sense for anyone.
One of the things that I've seen done at this architecture gallery in Toronto is they have sort of thematic panels on the wall and like an architectural model or whatever explaining sort of concept. And then at sort of the height of, say, maybe a 6-year-old, they have a circle on the wall that has sort of a much more simplified version, but still touches on the same themes and still directs attention to the model. So it's sort of a split tier thing.
Yeah, that's when you do studies of that kind of thing, where you have a kids labels and a grown-ups labels. It turns out almost all the grown-ups read the kids label.
And the kids don't read anything.
And the kids, right, exactly. So there was an exhibit that Williamsburg did on colonial history that had a cartoon version at kids level, and that was, I think, something like 80 or 90% of the people were just reading those.
That's actually really interesting, though, because even though it's meant for kids, it does do the same thing, which is it allows people to choose their level of engagement.
Exactly. And the assumption is always that grown-ups want to read it at a academic or curatorial level. And in fact, almost every study suggests that's a very small part of the audience. If you work on the assumption that, well, you don't have to read it if you don't want to, then you're still cluttering up the exhibit with it, maybe scaring people off. This is if you look at the studies, it's very hard to know whether you scare people away by providing more than one level. Okay, so there's lots more on learning and education. I want to move on, though, to a little bit more on process. And a little bit dull here, because this is sort of where you end up with lots of flowcharts and budgets and boring things like that. So this is sort of the overall list. I'm just going to go through these step by step. So starting off with resources. So the famous thing, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about project management. You've got money, time, and space. And you can, if you have lots of money, you can do things more quickly. If you have little money, it takes longer. If you have lots of space, you can get away with doing things that don't cost as much. Depending on what you've got, what resources are out there, what your skill is, this is where you're starting from. Exhibits are mostly driven by money and time. You can buy the right artifacts if you don't have them, but again, you're balancing all of these things. I mentioned a little bit before about audiences. Again, lots of audiences at the same time you have to worry about. They're there for all sorts of different reasons. They have different expectations. It's considered bad practice, I think, to say, well, we're only going to design this exhibit for experts or for collectors. Most museums at least pay lip service to We're here for everyone, which causes no end of problems. Another category is, and this is more what museum directors tend to worry about, is stakeholders, which is sometimes the audience, but is also the board and the donors and the accrediting agencies, if you're in states that do accreditation. More or less, it could be that it's the people you're doing the show about in some audiences. If you're doing a show about Native Americans, the tribe is probably the largest stakeholder. If you're doing a show about military veterans feel like they're the stakeholders. This is an enormously complicated business. Museums love to say that they are eager to work with stakeholders, that they're a participatory organization. On the other hand, it's very, very time consuming to take this seriously and to do this well. And to figure out who the stakeholders are, and then when they're in disagreement with each other, how do you deal with that? Again, a whole lecture, whole course could be done on thinking about stakeholders. The thing that mostly affects people inside the museum is trying to figure out the folks who actually have some say over things directly. What does the museum board think about this? What does the director think about the project you're working on? And then who it is that you're about, what the topic is. A little bit on presentation, a couple of things. This is things I've talked about earlier when we talked about you've got artifacts in the museum, you've got things, you've got models, dioramas, you have all this stuff to show. That's one way of presenting things. Another is, can you substitute audio or video for immersive interactives instead of artifacts? Can you have people, mannequins in the show? Can you have docents who explain everything? Are sometimes things best done by having live performances? What is the appropriate place to use words? What's the appropriate place to use pictures? This is the art of exhibit design, and the main thing there is to note that lots of possibilities. What makes exhibits so much fun. Another thing that I think museums worry about appropriately is what makes an exhibition seem true. Why should anybody believe what you're saying? If you're at the Smithsonian, there's an assumption that whatever you say has been thoroughly researched and it's all true, but is it because it's full of real objects? Is it because museums got a staff that is respected? Is it the individual story that seems to make it true, that it has a compelling arc and so it sort of is convincing? How do you balance all of these things is another question.
Steve, what is
verisimilitude? The appearance of being true. So this is where oftentimes people will say the things that makes museums seem true are we have the real objects. That's sort of true, but in fact, most of the objects are not quite that real when you look at them closely, and how you deploy them is something to keep in mind. Another one, complexity, and this is the challenge that so much about museum exhibitions is how to simplify and tell a story that's easy to get while people are wandering through in their average 3-minute stay in an exhibition. On the other hand, you want to say we're diverse audiences, many points of view. How do you capture nuance in an exhibition that is in a medium that is not really designed for nuance? This is what drives traditional curators crazy, is you're always simplifying. You're writing at an 8th grade level, you're writing 50 words, and you know how complicated things are. Anyway, that's the challenge. How do you measure effectiveness? I keep coming back to this because it's really important to remember. Outputs versus outcomes is what the social science folks who do evaluation talk about all the time. It's really easy to say, we were successful. We have an exhibit up on the floor. that proves that we spent your money wisely. We accomplished what we said we were going to do, as opposed to outcomes, which is we said that we would improve education in the 8th grade so that the test scores go up from 52% to 65%. That's an outcome. It's rare that you can measure exhibition work that well. So much of the evaluation work that is expected now comes out of social science or education rather than out of the museum field, and they like that kind of number. How you come up with the right metric for effectiveness. You know, the easiest thing to do is we had 10,000 people come through this exhibit. That's one way of measuring things. They spent an average of 27 minutes in this show, and before we did the renovations, they only spent an average of 22 minutes. That's sort of nice. That's easy to measure. To say, and they learned things, and they remembered a year later, is really hard to measure. So again, what you measure is really hard. There's a lot of hand waving that goes on. There's lots of studies. The Smithsonian has online, dozens of these studies trying to deal with this. And I think it's fair to say that nobody's quite figured it out. So that's sort of a big overview. I'm going to talk now more about the process and show off a couple of things here. I think most folks are very surprised by how much work goes into doing an exhibition. The average Smithsonian exhibit is a 5 or 8 year process of a team of maybe 30 or 40 people working on an exhibition. There's lots of organization. There's lots of projects lots of things that need to be pulled together. I'd like to show off a couple of things. I'm going to put over on the shelf in the library next door a couple of things. So this is exhibition process from the American History Museum. Basically, who gets to, what you have to submit when, what kind of, who gets to evaluate things, what you ask for, what kind of reviews go on, what kind of fundraising documents need to be done. Richard Rubinowitz, who's one of the best exhibition producers or conceptualizers around. This is his goals, resources, themes, design concepts, interpretive media, community connections, audience needs, financial and political realities. You can make this list longer, but that gives you a sense. It's a real complicated business. And after a while, you can start to go to an exhibition and start to see what work had to be done behind the scenes. So this is an image you've seen before. This is America on the Move exhibit. Just some of the work that went on behind the scenes in that exhibit. So basically inside that car there's a video which has all the things that you need to do for making a movie. You build a set, you have costumes, you write a script. There's a whole documentary video production inside there. That car had to be purchased. It took maybe a year and a half to restore. You had to figure out how to move it from Chicago to the restorer to the museum. Had to figure out how to install it. When you're dealing with really big objects, like a subway car, you end up, it's a small, you're building a small building. So just this guy in the front here, there's a huge literature out there of historic postures. So, nowadays, people walking to work in the morning look like this, right? They all have a cup of coffee in their hand. 1950s, no cups of coffee. They're carrying a newspaper under their arm. If you go back to look at 18th century postures, there's a whole world out there that people look differently. And there are firms out there that for about $30,000 or $40,000 a piece will make these mannequins that look right. What kind of hat he should be wearing. There's an enormous amount of work that goes into making that look accurate. What would people have been hearing? There's a whole, again, another academic field of soundscapes. And then artists who do sound installations. How do you use sound, and what sounds are appropriate? Really complicated. Handicap access for getting in and out of the space. So this is, talk about authenticity or not, this is the, trying to make it look like an elevated station in Chicago. Well, should this be real or can you just fabricate it? How important is it that it be the actual thing? So that actually is the actual piece of a subway station, of an elevated station, but of course cut down to fit that whole acquisition process. So how much do you keep putting in? So there's an empty space where you would have been in the waiting room, the window. Should there be a video in there? Or should you just reproduce historic period ad? That kind of thing is something you think about. Yeah?
Did Rabinowitz do this exhibit right here?
What?
Did he do this with the car and everything?
This is my show.
Oh, okay. I mean, I just asked.
Yeah, no, this is at the American History
Oh.
Museum. This is how you can spend $20 million on an exhibition. So there's a backdrop here that's supposed to be Chicago 1950. Well, it's not just a big photograph. You want it to be something that is both accurate but also gives you the right perspective, so when you walk by it, you sort of feel like you're in the city. And then somebody has to figure out what all this costs. This is probably, this display is probably $1 million at least. It's probably the most expensive display. Researched to a degree that no one will ever appreciate. To the point of, you can see the lights blinking in the windows behind in the car. When you ride the L in Chicago, the lights blink on and off at a particular time as you go over the various, the tracks. Those are all accurate. The shadows cast by the buildings as you go by are all accurate for a particular day of the year. So there's a level of obsession you can get into with this, but this is what makes things seem real.
Yeah.
Maybe. Just to give you a sense, this is from the Manual of Museum Management, of Exhibit Management, which is sort of gives you a sense of the planning process. So it sort of goes around, starting here, development, design, implementation. Every museum will have slightly different phrases and different ways to break it up. But it's sort of the category of what it takes to develop it, the surveys that you might do, design phase, different phases in design, and then building, fabrication, installation, saw film, thing, that kind of thing. So, and the other thing to remember, it goes back to what Rabinowitz has said about it taking a community. This is a typical big exhibition team, but on a big exhibit project, you might have a developer, person who would be trained in education, but is often called an audience advocate. Again, the terms keep changing. A project manager to keep track of all of the expenses and the schedule. Somebody whose job it is just to deal with the collections. Lots of researchers, and then a whole separate field of picture researchers, figure out how to get rights to use everything, and then designers and builders. And then the rest of the museum is there to support all of this. It's a complicated exhibition with a complicated set of projects. You will often hire consultants. This is just there are always more consultants out there. More and more, a lot of the work museums do is contracted out to consultants. But these are some of the people who make their living as museum consultants. Many museums will contract out entire exhibits now. This is more and more the style. But this is just, again, complexity here. I mentioned that break this up into different phases of, you've got the development, you've got design, you've got implementation, then evaluation. Probably should have evaluation as part of development as well. And the other thing is that these all overlap in interesting ways. They're not really, But to give you a sense, and I'll go a little bit more quickly here because I want to show some things off. This is a typical sort of what you would do before you've got permission to do the exhibition. So if you're at a big museum, somebody has an idea, you start to do some planning, you get your communities involved, and then you eventually come up with what big museums call an exhibition brief. So this is typical exhibition brief. It's got each of the sections, it's got a diagram of how they fit together, it's got the main label or something like it, and then interpretive strategy at a glance. These are what we're going to do. The premise, the perspective, the objective, the method. And it goes through every section, lots of pictures. Partly it's to convince the director to do it, partly it's to use for fundraising. But this kind of thing is called an exhibition brief. It can be 2 pages, or it can be something like this, or it can be a big bound book that you give to the donors.
Could you pass it around?
Oh, absolutely. Pass that one around, and I've got a bunch of these here. Not all of these are exhibition briefs. Some of these are slightly different. The next stage, that's the design concept for the museum at Anchorage. Then there's master plans. I'll just pass some of those around to take a look at it. I'll put them all on the shelf over there. This is for the American History Museum, typical for a large museum, proposal form. What's the subject? Goals and objectives are really an interesting thing. Say up front, what's the point of it? What are you trying to do? Train scholarship may or may not be important to some museums. I love the list of audiences, and of course everybody has to check them all. And then more and more important, funding prospects. No point in talking about it if you can't get these things funded. This is again American History Museum, how you're supposed to fit in to the goals. And this is what you're supposed to have at the end of the development phase. This is from the Alaska Gallery, which is being passed around. First, there's responses, so they did some surveying. Then they did a planning document. So this is each area, this is the theme, this is the objects, and then comments, cross-references, footnotes. And you'll see if you look at some of the, so this would be this is a museum. There are many things here at museums that never happened. The Museum of Business History, it would be lots of drawings like this, lots of bubble diagrams, schedules. I'll just pass that one around too. So this is what a typical proposal schedule would look like about how they exhibit should be done. Program development, schematic design, design development, broken into many phases. Final design and construction documents, exhibit fabrication and installation. That's short. A big exhibit will go on for 10 pages like that. And then there's some of these that have that. The exhibit brief that you're looking at, I mentioned for fundraising, bubble diagrams are important. The bubble diagrams are worth thinking about because it's actually what we're going to try to do on Friday, is to do a fancy bubble diagram with pictures. Lots of different techniques. This is sticky notes and lines on a bulletin board. This is from the California exhibit on very much a general sense of what we're trying to get across, how they connect. They are often tied to actual spaces. So this is a class project for a show in the carriage house, the holes. And you know what space you're working in. In this case, you can't build new walls. You have to figure out how they all go together. This is another carriage house exhibit, and we'll be talking about more. the slavery exhibit, what we're going to focus on Friday. How do you organize things in a way that makes sense for space and for the story you're trying to tell? Lots of pretty pictures. There are folks out there who do nothing but draw pretty pictures to raise money. So that's the design phase. When you're done with that, you have schematic design. A big museum will talk about 10% design, 30% design, final design. The folks who are working on the Smithsonian exhibit, on business history exhibit, the folks there are always saying, we're past the 10% design, we can't change that anymore, but we're still in the 30% design, so we can change some things. It gets more and more expensive to make changes as you move along. Budgets, selection of images, talked about all of this. A little bit more on the curatorial side. A huge part on the curatorial side, once you're past the conceptualization of the exhibit, is keeping track of things. And so being organized, having the right databases is enormously important. And there are systems out there that do this. The Park Service has a very nice system that anybody can use. But you're worrying about things like, you're going to show off the command module. You want to know how much it's worth, but also what kind of dolly you need to move it, and what conservation it needs, what security it needs. You want to have for each section, every object gets a number, description, who is in charge of it, who to contact, where it is right now, and as things move around, you keep track of them. Same thing for images. We spend a lot of time worrying about keeping track of images, and there's a whole separate world of rights and getting rights to use images. Talk about later. Script is the thing that curators spend a lot of time working on. These are the words on the walls, the words on the interactive. And it is, what's supposed to happen? This is what a script looks like for, this is again the transportation exhibit. It tends to be divided up by section. It tends to be, we'll often say main label, photo. Again, keeping track of all this is a huge problem. You have in your photo database that it's a courtesy of so-and-so. That has to get into the script and be kept up to date in the script as well. Then if you have objects, this page doesn't show objects, but it becomes a keeping track of those with what label goes where. And then at some point, all of this has to be converted from this into a diagram that somebody can actually go out and produce. Other thing that we worry about a lot in exhibit labels is hierarchy. So this is this would be a section label, which is sort of the biggest size print. Photo label would be a different size print. In general, a good exhibit designer will say, these are the 5 levels of hierarchy you're allowed to have. Curators will always say, but this one's a little bit different, some other style. So you need to think about that. There's another page, different section with object labels. You have to keep track of everything in a way of getting it so that the gift of that's on your object list shows up in your labels that get typeset at some point. Yes.
Are they duplicating these websites? These databases for the web presence, like when they put stuff online, or are they just feeding them?
In theory, they should be all kept together. The holy grail is that you have a database that ends up, you can just call out the pieces you need for each thing. Most museums haven't quite got that figured out yet. In theory, you ought to be able to go from your database to something that looks like an exhibit script. I've yet to see that really work. Just a few more things. I'll go through quickly what the designer does. The first step is you need a design that's detailed enough that somebody can bid on it and say, I'll build this for so much money. which turns out to be a pretty detailed design. So this is one exhibition. Some of you may have seen this, or just
No, it looks like it's on a napkin.
It is on a napkin, I think. Or on this. So this is a bubble diagram. A designer would sit in a meeting with the curatorial team, come up with a bunch of ideas, how to organize things. Designer goes away, comes up with a more schematic way, a more considered way. Starts to think about what the individual shapes are in the exhibit. Worries about how to build them. So this is what it would look like. Somehow seems appropriate to the topic. Thinking a lot about colors at this stage, or thinking about materials depending on what you're building. These are just printed on canvas. Lots of this kind of drawing, what it feels like a computer-generated model. Now you have a computer-generated fly-through of here's what it looks like as you walk through. And then trying to fit all the text that the curator wrote into this size that the curator agreed to. Lots and lots of back and forth on, here, delete the definitions, switch this picture. It becomes a lot of back and forth with designers. Then this needs to go to somebody to actually build the things. This is what a contractor would get to actually build it. And this is what the show actually looks like when it's all done and put together. I think I will stop there because people have to leave. But once you've got that, then you've actually got to go and build a whole other world. So there's a real quick overview of sort of process. I will send out a note about class on Friday to give you some stuff to look at beforehand. And remember, Friday we meet in the library on the first floor in the visualization room. Thank you.
Be sure